Representatives, I'm pleased to join you here today to hear more about your insights and how moderates are making a difference in Congress and improving the functionality of the institution, which is so important for us today. Representative Katko, you co-lead the Republican Governance Group, and Representative Murphy, you are one of the leads of the Blue Dog Coalition, both groups of moderates and Republicans and moderates Democrats who often work across party lines. What led you to these moderate caucuses, and how are they making a difference in Congress today?
So I had never served in elected office until 2017, and I come from a background having worked in the business world as well as at the Pentagon after 9/11. And for me, at the Pentagon, we never looked left or looked right and said, hey, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? We always just said, what's the mission? And how do we keep this country safe? How do we move it forward? And we focused on that. And so that sort of frames the way that I approach my job as a member of Congress. What things are good for my constituents, what moves this country forward, and what sits with my conscience. And so being a part of and having the honor of now leading Blue Dogs has been an incredible platform for me to be able to live into that as a member of Congress.
It's very similar for me. I've never been in an elected office before. I was a federal organized crime prosecutor for 20 years, and every single case, when you're negotiating with a defense attorney about anything, you have to give and take. And I realized that was a lost art here in Congress, and so when someone asked me to run, I realized that's something I wanted to do. So when I came to Congress, I decided I am not even going to submit a bill unless I have a Democratic co-sponsor before I submit it and a lead. And that has made a dramatic difference in my ability to move legislation. But also, very similar to Stephanie, as leadership of the moderate wing of the party, a leader of the moderate wing of the party, we just want to get things done. And it doesn't matter. I don't care if she's a Democrat or Republican. If she wants to work with me, I'm going to work with her. And I can tell you, you get excoriated sometimes by your own party. Because especially during election season, I happen to be very good friends with someone near me in another district, and sometimes when we appear together, I get calls from party folks saying, why are you with him? We're trying to take him out. I'm like, well, he wants to get things done. And that's what you have to do. And that's what I think, unless we get back to people like Stephanie and myself, having more of us in Congress, we're going to have this stratification where the far left and the far right dominate the narrative. And we're fighting every day to break through that, every day.
We know that the media in these times tends to focus more on the extreme voices in Congress, but yet the moderates comprise a very significant block of members. In the divided Congress, groups like the Republican Governance Group and the Blue Dog Coalition, have an even greater opportunity to influence key legislation that's moving through the process. Where are the opportunities that you see this Congress and moving into next?
Well, what's remarkable is the vast majority of legislation is not controversial, right? And we do it under what's called suspension, where basically no one's objecting. But when I'm talking about big ticket items, I think that's what you're talking about. I think infrastructure, there's not a person in this room that probably doesn't think we need to do more with infrastructure. That's one area. The opioids, we've done a Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, completely bipartisan. We did 21st Century Cures, which was a huge multi-billion-dollar bill to get directed funding to National Institutes of Health to say find cures for certain things. 3 years ago that happened when I was first in Congress, and they're already starting to see results that may have dramatic long-term effects on healthcare. So there are a lot of good things, and there's a lot of good things we can continue to work on. I think infrastructure is one of the last big hopes for me this term.
And I agree with John on the list of topics that I think we can work on in Congress. What I'll say is, as the leader of the Blue Dogs, this Congress, because the Democrats are in the majority and the majority is fairly narrowly held, the way that we wield our influence is by using our unity as our leverage. And I lead a group of 25 moderate members, and what we have been able to use that leverage to change legislation as it goes through the committee process before it gets to the floor, to make sure that we can craft legislation that has the broadest possible support, and Republican as well as Democratic support. Because the fact of the matter is that we govern in divided government, and so the only bills that are going to become law are the ones that can make it through a divided government, and the bills that become law can actually affect the lives of our constituents. And for us, that's the goal. And we've been able to use our leverage in that way this Congress.
Yeah, if I can comment just briefly, I've been in a majority for 4 years, and now I'm in a minority. When you're in the majority and you're moderate, that's when you really earn your stripes. Am I right about that? Because you have to stand up to leadership and you have to stand up to the vast majority of your folks may feel differently than you, but that's when you really have to shine, and Stephanie's done a wonderful job of that. And I like to think when we were in the majority that I stood up a lot too and took some tough votes and took some tough stands, and after a while, leadership will start respecting you and start understanding that you're a force to be reckoned with, and that's our job.
I don't know how many folks are aware of the fact that this Congress, on a very broad bipartisan basis, the House stood up a select committee on the modernization of Congress. What advice would you give to that committee or others on, lessons that you've learned about how to work across the aisle? How can the institution create more incentives for that type of effort?
Well, I think we just, I'm sure your turn. You go first. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, John.
I'm from New York. I can't help it. I just think that leading by example, by showing that when we get together, touting when we get together, touting that we're working with the other side, burnishing our images by saying we're working with the other side all the time, that's how you lead by example, and I think that's the best way to do it. There's a lot of things in Congress that need to be revamped. A lot of old-style things aren't working, and from office pay to these kids that work for us are making literally $32,000, $35,000 a year starting out in Washington. It's brutal for them to try and make ends meet. But to just the things about how the operations are run, and I think the more we can do to set the example that we're not afraid to work across the aisle, the easier it is to get through those tough issues.
And in addition to what the Modernization Committee is looking at moving forward that John mentioned, I want to kind of I think we were a part of this effort at the beginning of this Congress where Democrats and Republicans made a pact before we knew the outcome of the November elections and said, hey, whoever is in the majority, we're going to hold the Speaker to the idea that they have to change some of the House rules to enable bipartisan amendments and bipartisan legislation to come forward. So because it was our party that ended up in the majority, I was involved in these negotiations that created what we call a consensus calendar. And so if you have broad bipartisan support for a piece of legislation, it can go through committee and to the floor without needing leadership's approval. And I think that has loosened up some of the ability for us to work in a bipartisan way and advance ideas that are broadly supported. And I know, John, you voted on that rules?
I was one of the 3 Republicans that voted for it, and I got my ass kicked, but it was worth it. But it was worth it.
Because now there are things that Republicans and Democrats agreed to that have been able to come to the floor as a result of that very brave vote that he took and the stand that we took at the end of.
This isn't a mutual admiration society, but it took a lot of guts to stand with someone like Pelosi and leadership and say, we're not voting for you for Speaker unless you accept our rules package. That takes a lot of guts. And so to back them up is how you demonstrate that it's not just talk, we're walking the walk, and that's really important.
Right. Clearly the coronavirus is on the minds of all of us today, but this comes on top of a health crisis that counties have been dealing with for quite some time, which is the opioid epidemic, which you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit more about how your caucuses are working on this issue and how we can advance that debate forward and get some solutions out there?
Well, we were able to pass the fentanyl, and I'm going to forget the exact name of the act, but to do it in a bipartisan way and address that health issue. Because I think for us, opioids doesn't discriminate between Democrats or Republicans, and all of our districts are experiencing it. And so it's incredibly important that whether it's the opioid crisis or the coronavirus, we have to work in a bipartisan way and coordinate from local, state, and federal level in our response. I, at the Pentagon, had worked on the avian flu, the department's response to that, and the big lesson I learned there was the greater the amount of coordination and transparency of information, the better able you are to contain these types of health crises. And I think as we move forward with addressing the coronavirus, it's going to be incredibly important to have these bipartisan voices and the platforms that we lead and using that muscle memory to address this crisis.
Yeah, Stephanie's being very modest. She's leaving right now after this to go to the White House to speak with Vice President because she's on the coronavirus task force. So she's the expert on that. But when you talk about Bipartisanship and the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, or CARA, and CARA 2.0, which is coming up, really it defines when necessity brings people together. And the opioid crisis is killing 5 people an hour in this country. And so that we provided billions of dollars for treatment, for prevention, and law enforcement. And it had an effect. It's not enough, but it's a darn good start, and it's definitely having an impact. In one of my counties, the heroin overdose death rate has dropped about 60% in the last 2 years, which is great. In other counties, it's holding steady. So we've got ways to go, but it's a good start.
Great. Representatives, I was hooking into the Wi-Fi this morning, and one of the themes that popped up for the Wi-Fi was communities matter. What are the lessons you take from your community that you carry forward today that you think are the most important lessons?
Well, for my community, Ryan McMahon, you're here somewhere from Onondaga County. I don't know where you're out there, but Ryan and I are very close, and we're very close with the mayor. The mayor is an independent, and Ryan's a Republican, I'm a Republican, but we realize we have a lot of Democrats, and we try and focus on issues that can affect the community positively. We're doing an awful lot to try and get funding to the states through the grant program so that they can then fix the sewer system, which is going to be a multi-$100-million project over 20 years. But we're giving them the funding that helps them do that, and we're doing it together. And we're appearing together. We don't endorse each other, we don't do all that nonsense, but we just do things together. And we had HUD Secretary Ben Carson come up, for example, and we sat down with him. We had a roundtable about HUD-related issues and poverty, and a lot of money flow back to us as a result of it. All 3 of us are together on camera, and so when your constituents see that you're working together, you don't have to say anything about working together. You're just doing it, and people notice it. And so we try to do that on a regular basis, and Ryan's been wonderful with that.
I just want to commend the county officials and executives that are here for the work that you do on a day-to-day basis to make this country run. And you focus on getting it done. Focus on what the immediate need of the community is and how best to address it. And I just have the honor of being able to try to bring the federal level resources and then clear the way a bit for my county execs. And it's just a real great honor to work with my counties to serve our community. And you all have such an incredibly disproportionate effect on the everyday lives of Americans. And you do it in a way without all of the noise that sometimes we live in here in Washington. So thank you all, and thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
When you look towards the next Congress, what are 3 issues that you think you'd like to see the next Congress tackle?
Lowering the cost of prescription drugs, increasing access to affordable quality health care, and infrastructure. We are...
Yep.
On infrastructure, we are driving on roads built 50 years ago, drinking out of waterways 100 years old, and the rural-urban divide is getting worse and worse because we can't extend access to broadband, or we haven't been able to ensure every American, no matter what zip code they're born in, has access to the kind of infrastructure that gives them a shot at the American dream. And so that has to be first and foremost. It's hard in an election year to figure out the pay-for of the infrastructure package. So I hope that we make a down payment on infrastructure this Congress, but that has to be the #1 priority for us in the next Congress.
I completely agree with your 3 priorities, and I just want to break down one of them while I have a minute, and that is infrastructure. Just take the highway bill, for example. We're operating on $1994. It's about 40 cents on the dollar now. They haven't changed the revenue stream. We have cars getting more and better gas mileage. We have non-gasoline burning vehicles. UPS, FedEx are ordering all electric fleets, so they won't be paying any gas tax because they're not going to be using gas. So what do? You have to sit down and you have to, in a bipartisan manner, without scare tactics, say, where are we going to get the revenue from, and how do we get it on a long-term course so we don't have to deal with this every few years. You should index it however you do it. And I think the best way to do it is what's called a VMT, or Vehicle Miles Traveled device. Problem is, people don't want Big Brother in their living room, and they don't want Big Brother following the government, knowing where they're going and how much gas, how many miles they're driving. But we got to figure out how to use that type of a system, so it doesn't matter what kind of vehicle you're using. If you're using the road, you're going to pay a tax of some sort. I'd like to see down the road somehow figure out a better revenue stream, do pilot projects for a highway bill for a 5-year term, and then sunset whatever the revenue stream is and go to a VMT once we figure out the privacy issues. And I think we need to set on a trajectory where we don't have to worry about it, and you guys can plan a lot better than you can right now. When we're lurching from continuing resolution to continuing resolution, you can't plan. And we can't do that. We have the biggest project in the history of Syracuse coming up with a $2 billion plus highway revitalization plan. And we got to make sure we have to do our job to deliver those funds. So I agree with you. That, prescription drugs, and healthcare are the 3 big ones for us.
That's great. Representative Murphy, Representative Katko, I know I speak for many of us here today when I say the public is better served by having members like you in Congress who are willing to set aside politics and find a way to work together across the aisle to deal with some of these issues like infrastructure and opioids and other issues that are clearly facing this, pressing issues facing this nation and this country. Thank you for your service and your time today.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.